Good morning and Merry Christmas. Only 2 weeks left until Christmas, and I hope that doesn't stress you out for me to say it, though I imagine it does. I hope that you're not overcome with the holiday stress. I know many of you are traveling this Christmas, as am I. I won't be here next week. Can't tell you where we're going because it's a surprise for the girls, and I don't trust any of you not to leak it. So that's not really true, but I don't want to get it out. So we're taking the girls on a surprise trip for Christmas, and we're going to miss you while we're gone, but we leave you in good hands, and Stuart will be preaching next week, and it's going to be a wonderful time for all of you to be here. And even if you're not traveling, if you're staying here for the holiday season, we're praying for you too. You know, we often say that we pray for those who are traveling, but we pray for those who don't travel too. As you can see from this collection of poinsettias, this is obviously a congregation that cares for and prays for one another. Each and every one of these poinsettias is a visual representation of the prayers of one family for another during this holiday season. So even if the holiday stress or the holiday blues has found a home with you this season, please just take a minute or however long you need to zone out and stare at these plants and remember that your church family loves you and cares for you. And if you hear nothing else this morning, or if you remember nothing else, feel that. Much in the same way that we have seen and heard and felt between Paul and the Philippians the last several weeks. There's no doubt that Paul was very close to the Christians in Philippi and vice versa. They were good friends who not only cared deeply for one another, but also took care of one another. Church in Philippi took care of Paul while he was in prison, and Paul took care of and mentored those who were at the church in Philippi. There was a friendship of mutual edification, which is why it comes as no surprise that at the end of the letter, Paul tacks on a rapid-fire round of a list of advice and counsel for his friends as they struggle to maintain unity with one another. At the end of this very well-crafted letter of friendship, Paul almost bombards the Philippians with a list of short quips of advice, one-liners to help them through the coming days. And this was absolutely expected. Though we are tempted to read these as one-liners, they're far from it. Much like genres of literature in the ancient world, there were genres of letters. That might seem a bit odd. After all, when was the last time you fired off a letter to your cousin in the genre of science fiction? But weird as it may sound, there were strict genres and forms to letter writing in antiquity, and this letter to the Philippians is a textbook example of a letter of friendship. We aren't always familiar with all the rules of ancient letter genres, and there are too many to bore you with this morning, though I can recommend a few good books if you're interested. The one in particular that I want you to notice, the one particularity that is worth mentioning, is paranesis. Typically, a letter of friendship like this is full of paranesis, which is to say that it contains a lot of advice, both solicited and unsolicited. In this case, we assume that Paul has heard directly from the Philippians about some kind of a situation, and they have requested his help and counsel. So he writes a letter of friendship packed full of advice, as would have been expected. Often in this type of letter writing, the author will put on the end of the letter a whole bunch of advice, not randomly or without purpose, but intentionally, almost like a step-by-step set of directions on how to treat the symptoms of the situation. And Paul, also being a very smart guy, also knows what Aristotle said over and over and over again, that if you're trying to get somebody to hear you, tell them what you're going to say, and then say it, and then tell them what you said. And in Philippians chapter 4, where we are in the tell them what you said already part of the passage, part of the chapter, part of the book. In the case of Philippians 4, just in the verses we read today, you can find several great bumper stickers that stand on their own, each offering their own sermon in and of themselves, without explanation. Rejoice in the Lord always. That's the first sermon bumper sticker, followed closely by the second sermon, and again I say rejoice. It's a fine sermon, all by itself, needing no explanation. So is sermon number 3, do not worry. That one seems a bit optimistic, but we can all agree that it would be nice. Sermon 4 gets more screen time and advises us to pray to God with thanksgiving about everything. Makes for a lovely cross stitch to hang in your home this time of year. Sermon 5 declares the protective power of the peace of God. That gets the alliteration points. And each of these sermonettes, all on their own, without further need of explanation, they powerfully and they simply declare very specific, very unique, very easily understood advice on being a follower of Jesus. But their true power and their function is only seen when we read them together, not in some sort of Captain Planet jigsaw puzzle kind of way where we can put them all together and try to make them make sense, but truly understanding them through the lens of a paranetic letter of friendship. You see, these pieces of advice are not unrelated strands of bumper sticker wisdom. Rather, they are interconnected. They're codependent. It's advice, it's counsel that would help guide those who would follow to a common and singular goal. Everything in this letter of friendship, every hymn, every quote, every echo or allusion, situation, all of it, everything from chapter 1 through chapter 4, every piece of advice that has been given is working toward one specific point, one goal that Paul has set for the Philippians. And we find it back in chapter 1, verse 27. Live your life in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent and hear about you, I will know that you are standing firm in one spirit, striving side by side with one mind for the faith of the gospel, and are in no way intimidated by your opponents. That's it. That's the whole point. That's the culmination of all of it. As you read through every single verse of Philippians, you should be hearing this one in the back of your mind, or in the front of it. It's the filter through which we see the whole letter. Paul wants more than anything for the Philippians to live their faith together with one another, the point that they be found holy and blameless when Christ returns. So when we read the advice in chapter 4, we should read it with chapter 1 in mind. And everything in chapter 4 is written so that the Philippians might live their lives in a manner worthy of the gospel. Rejoice always. Pray with thanksgiving. Do not worry. Trust in the peace of God, all as a way of living your life worthy of the gospel, that you can stand firm in one spirit, striving side by side with one another. These are not random pieces of wisdom. This is intentionally chosen, hand-picked, crafted pieces of advice that will help the Philippians to achieve their hope, the hope that Paul has set out for them. And this is how Christians live in one spirit with one another, not in isolation or individually, but together. I know you all know this, but sometimes it's easy to forget. This letter was not addressed to one individual. It certainly isn't addressed to you as an individual. Never has, never will be. Or me, or any one person. It was written to a group of Christians in Philippi. And it still speaks to groups of Christians throughout the world today. This is where I have to give you my semi-annual Southern plug for the need to bring back the word y'all into Bible translations. Every single you in this text in Philippians, this letter, it's a plural, it's a y'all, it's a you guys, it's everyone, not just a you individual. We miss that when we read this. This letter is written to a group of Christians in Philippi, and it speaks to a group of Christians throughout the world today, but always a group. Paul didn't hope that the Christians in Philippi would individually live a life worthy of the gospel. It was never about one person's life, but that they would do it together. It was a shared life, standing firm with one another. And therefore, the same is true when we get to chapter 4. Paul isn't telling individuals to rejoice or not worry or to pray or to be thankful or to have peace. Paul is telling a whole church to do those things together. In fact, chapter 1, verse 27 lines up pretty well with chapter 4, verses 4 through 7. Paul offers advice in chapter 4, and in chapter 1 answers the question of how. So if chapter 4 says rejoice, And we ask how chapter 1 tells us with one spirit. Let your gentleness be known, but how? To everyone. Let your reputation precede you. Do not worry, but how? How do we not worry? By standing firm with one another. Have peace. Well, how? By not letting your opponents intimidate you together. And in each and every instance, the advice Paul gives is to be lived out together and in community. It's one thing to be joyful by yourself, and another altogether to be joyful with others. And it's more difficult to worry when you are with others because a church family can help you with your worry, either to resolve it or to encourage you or to share the worry with you. It can be difficult to always be thankful by yourself, but with others, there's always a reason to give thanks. We may not be by ourselves capable of finding and resting in the peace of God individually, but together we can help each other. We can provide solace. We can live in peace together. So if you read these verses in chapter 4 as if they were written to you as an individual, they can sound rather patronizing or overly optimistic or impossible. But if we read them in their proper communal context, we find something achievable, a description of what it means to be a people of faith, striving side by side together to live a shared life worthy of the gospel of Christ. But what does that even look like? It looks like, well, this, for starters. It looks like people who are reminding each other that they are cared for, even though they might be lonely during the holidays. We love holidays, but for all of us, holidays are reminders of those who aren't here with us to celebrate. And this is a reminder that we are not alone. That's what this looks like, to strive together side by side for one faith in the gospel. It looks like strangers that you've never met showing up to a funeral for a loved one just because they wanted you to not be alone. You had nothing in common with them, but they show up anyway because the one thing you do have in common is this faith that you share. I can say that from experience. When my grandparents died, people who I had never met, people my father had never met, came to support our family, not because they had to, but because they were available to do so, and they knew that it wasn't right to leave our family alone whenever they are hurting. If it sounds patronizing or condescending or impossible to always be rejoicing, and again I say it, to always be rejoicing in the Lord, it's because you're doing it by yourself. But whenever you have a family, a church family like this one, there are moments whenever you don't rejoice, but you can rejoice with those around you. There are moments whenever you don't see what's worth rejoicing about in your own life, but somebody else here can point it out and help you to see it. We do it together. We treat each other with gentleness, even though the rest of the world has trained us to be cynical and skeptical and rude and selfish, and here gentleness prevails. In a church family, we find peace, a peace that's not just a lack of conflict, but a peace that comes from God and protects our heart and our mind together from the chaos of the world. So we come here and we pray with thanksgiving, even on days when the country is crying and mourning as tornadoes have ripped through towns and torn them apart. Because the one thing a tornado can't tear apart is the commonality we have as a family of believers. It's the one thing we're not going to lose, the one thing that nobody can take away from us, as long as we stand firm together. But if we all decide that each of us individually matters more than us as a family collectively, we have nothing to rejoice over. We have no gentleness or peace or thanksgiving. The church is the one place where selfishness can never prevail. And we see that most clearly, always clearly, in the cross, where selfishness never existed. The one moment in all of history where selfishness could not ever be found. And the Son of God giving his life for the world. Christmas is about a lot of things, and 'tis the season for everybody to tell you what Christmas is really about. And everybody has their own take of it. But hear from Paul in Philippians chapter 1 and chapter 4 this morning that Christmas has always been about being a family together. There are those here that are traveling to see family this Christmas, and those here that are not and have no one to celebrate it with. So please find somebody who you think might be alone this Christmas. Celebrate it together. Rejoice together. Be thankful together. Be a family together. And I know you do because I see it here. Every one of these poinsettias is a reminder that we do care for one another, that we love one another, that we stand together with one another. Though we may not always see it, and we may not always be good at it, it's who we are, ingrained in our DNA. How could we be anything else? Because how could the cross be anything else? You see, when Jesus told his followers to take up their cross and follow him, it wasn't just an expression of to take up your execution or to take up your persecution or to carry your pain and follow. That wasn't it. Take up your cross and follow Christ is to take up the rejoicing too, and the thanksgiving and the gentleness and the peace, these things that help us to stand together with one another. It's a very beautiful description of what the church is and always has been. So much more than a cross stitch or a bumper sticker. This isn't random wisdom. This is the ideal verbal description, the painting that Paul paints of what a church looks like. And I'm glad to be part of one here that looks just like that. And I know that because I see it every Sunday during this Christmas season with these flowers, and I see it in how we treat one another, love one another, and I give thanks for that this morning. I hope you all do too. If you need to lean into your family this holiday season, do so. Take advantage of your family, because that's not taking advantage, it's just being a family. So as we sing the next two songs, the elders will be in the back, available to pray with anyone who wants to pray, or anyone who wants to become part of this family, or anyone who needs something from this family. Let us rejoice with one another. Let us be gentle with one another. Let us not worry together. And let us find peace in our worship of God this morning.